Have you ever stopped to think about war? Not just as a historical event or as something that happens over there, but as something with deep moral implications? What makes a war just, if anything? Is it possible that war, this ancient and destructive force, could ever be justified by a moral standard? Imagine for a moment. You're sitting in your living room, scrolling through the news. The headlines are filled with stories of conflicts, distant places where soldiers clash, where civilians suffer, where lives are shattered. You don't know these people. They're just names in the headlines, faces in blurry photos. And yet, somehow, the world feels smaller. The stories, so far removed from your own life, are impossible to ignore. You feel a weight in your chest. You wonder, is war always a failure? Can it ever be anything but the destruction of what it means to be human? These questions can haunt the quiet moments. They're not easy to answer, and it's this very complexity that calls us to dig deeper. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most profound of these questions. Can war ever be morally justified? As you sit there, mulling over the question, you wonder if there's an answer that doesn't involve turning away from the uncomfortable truth. After all, war is not an abstract concept. It's the destruction of families, the loss of innocence, the crumbling of societies. But at the same time, history is riddled with moments when war seemed unavoidable. Can there be a line, a boundary, beyond which war becomes justified? Or is war itself just the ultimate failure of humanity, the breakdown of our shared dignity and understanding? These questions are, in many ways, not just philosophical, they are deeply personal. As the world continues to turn, we are faced with choices, however small they may seem, that collectively shape the trajectory of our society. The question about war, then, might not just be about distant battles, but about our own complicity in perpetuating cycles of violence. Can we, as individuals, ever escape the moral responsibility of the larger systems in which we live? Let's reflect on this. Can a war ever be justified by the standards of morality, or is it, by its very nature, an irredeemable evil? The answer is more elusive than we'd like to admit. To start, let's explore an idea that has been around for centuries, a concept known as just war theory. This theory suggests that war can be morally justified under certain conditions. It proposes that there must be a just cause, a right intention, and a legitimate authority behind the declaration of war. In essence, just war theory tries to build a framework that makes sense of war's devastating impact. It seeks to differentiate between wars that are fought for righteous reasons and those that are simply acts of aggression or conquest. At first glance, this seems reasonable. After all, history has shown us wars fought against evil. World War II, for instance. The Allies fought to stop the spread of fascism and to put an end to the genocide perpetrated by Nazi forces. On paper, this seems like a clear-cut example of a just war. The cause was good, the intention was noble, and the authority to act was legitimate. But the more we reflect on these wars, the more complicated the picture becomes. Take, for instance, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over 200,000 people were killed almost instantly. Innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of war. They were not soldiers. They were mothers, fathers, children, people just living their lives. What was the justification for their deaths? Was it to end the war more quickly? To send a message to the world about the power of nuclear weapons? What's worse is the firebombing of Dresden, where thousands of civilians were killed in an effort to break the morale of Nazi Germany. In the aftermath, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Their homes, their communities forever scarred by the violence. Did they deserve to die in this way? Were their lives somehow less valuable than the greater cause for which the war was fought? They were innocent mere bystanders, victims of a conflict they had no role in initiating. These examples raise troubling questions. If we frame war through the lens of just cause, we must ask ourselves, can any cause truly justify the mass destruction and loss of life that war entails? Can the brutal reality of war, the wreckage of families, the trauma of survivors, the decimation of entire communities ever be morally acceptable, no matter how noble the cause? As you process these thoughts, a feeling of unease creeps in. It's easy to justify the bombings, the bombshells, the battles when viewed from a distance, when viewed through the lens of history. But as we bring it closer to home, closer to the humanity of the individuals involved, we start to see the cracks in the justification. The logic behind just war theory starts to crumble when confronted with the reality of human suffering. The more you think about it, the more conflicted you feel. How can we reconcile the destruction of lives that had nothing to do with the war, with the idea of justice? In theory, war might make sense, but in practice, it seems impossible to justify the suffering it causes. The more you wrestle with these questions, the less certain you become. Maybe, just maybe, there is no way to reconcile the cost of war with any moral standard we've been given. Now, let's consider something that shifts the perspective even further. What if we've been asking the wrong question all along? Perhaps the real issue isn't whether war can ever be justified. Perhaps the more important question is why we keep finding ourselves in situations where war seems inevitable. What drives us to conflict, despite our moral reservations? Consider this. Most wars don't begin on battlefields with soldiers in uniform. They begin with failed diplomacy, with long-standing grievances, with systemic inequalities, and with historical injustices. At their core, wars are often the result of misunderstandings, missed opportunities for peace, and entrenched divisions that we cannot seem to bridge. But there's an even deeper layer to this. The military-industrial complex plays a pivotal role in perpetuating war. War, for all its destructiveness, is also a lucrative business. Weapons manufacturers, defense contractors, and military planners profit from the perpetuation of conflict. Their interests are aligned not with peace, but with the ongoing cycle of war. This reality complicates the notion of just war. When profit is tied to destruction, how can we trust that wars fought in its name are truly just? Take the Cold War, for instance. It wasn't a traditional war, but it hung over the world for decades, casting a shadow of fear and suspicion. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, essentially the idea that both sides would destroy each other before backing down, was not peace, but a perverse form of stability built on the threat of annihilation. It kept the world from plunging into open conflict, but it didn't resolve the underlying issues. It didn't solve the problems of ideology, power, or inequality. It just postponed the inevitable. As you reflect on this, it hits you. War isn't just a choice made by governments. It's a system, an economic machine designed to sustain itself. And the people who suffer, the civilians, the innocents, are mere pawns in a game where the stakes are too high and the rules too flawed. War, it seems, is not just fought on battlefields. It's fought in the economy, in the media, in the very systems that we are part of. This realization is uncomfortable. It forces you to confront an even darker truth. We've allowed ourselves to be complicit in the systems that perpetuate war. The more you think about it, the more you see the full scope of the problem. War is not just a failure of individual leaders or nations. It's a structural failure, a collective failure of humanity itself. So, what does all of this mean? What does this journey through the moral complexities of war reveal? Maybe, just maybe, we need to rethink how we view war altogether. Rather than asking whether war can ever be justified, perhaps we should be asking, How do we stop ourselves from falling into the trap of thinking war is the only solution? There's an uncomfortable truth here that we cannot ignore. War is a failure, not just of governments, not just of armies, but of humanity itself. It's the failure to resolve conflicts peacefully. It's the failure to see humanity in those we are taught to view as enemies. War is a breakdown of communication, of understanding, of shared values. But there's hope. We don't have to accept war as inevitable. We have the power to build systems, diplomatic, economic, social, that prioritize dialogue over destruction. Just as we've invested billions in weapons and defense, we can choose to invest in peace. It won't be easy. It will take time, effort, and a profound shift in mindset. But imagine a world where war is not the default answer. A world where dialogue, diplomacy, and mutual understanding take precedence. Next time you hear about a conflict, any conflict, ask yourself, could this have been prevented? What can you do to support the idea that war isn't the only answer? More importantly, ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to live in? The choice is yours. It's not just about whether war can ever be justified. The question is whether we're willing to build a world where it never has to be. The power lies in our hands. The question is not about war, it's about the kind of world we're willing to create. And that choice is ours to make. If this message resonates with you, don't just let it end here. Take action in your own way. Leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on this? Can we ever break free from the inevitability of war, or is peace truly possible? I'd love to hear your perspective. Like and share this video to show your support for the idea that we can build a world where peace is the default.